Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alisha Prasanna Kumar, student of the Executive MBA program at GIM. It is my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of Goa Institute of Management and the International Center Goa. I would like to thank you for joining us today for this special event on the challenge of statelessness and migration in South Asia, an issue that is turning out to be more critical every day. May I request Professor Ajit Parulekar, our Director of Goa Institute of Management, and Dr. Pushkar, Director of International Center Goa, to escort Professor Brad Blitz to the dais. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Pushkar, who is the Director of International Center Goa since December 2016, a PhD in Political Science from Medical University with numerous publications on various issues like health sector reforms, democracy, public goods provision, higher education, and many more, to come forward and give us a formal welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Center Goa. I thought I would start pretty much the same way as I always do for these evening lectures or other programs that we have. I'm delighted that we have joined hands with the Goa Institute of Management for this particular lecture, for this public lecture on the challenge of statelessness and migration in South Asia. But imagine my surprise that when I was first informed that about this proposal, I said, how on earth is Goa Institute of Management getting a political scientist? Because I thought I was in the business of bringing political scientists to the center. I do occasionally, about one or two a year, but I have to mix things up because we have to also keep historians and sociologists and anthropologists and everybody else happy. So Dr. Parulekar, this is, I think, a fantastic initiative, and we have a brand new backdrop, signifying ICG's collaboration with the Goa Institute of Management, and I hope there will be many more such lectures or other programs to follow. Very warm welcome to our guest here, Professor Brad Blitz, Professor of International Politics and Policy at the University College London Institute of Education. Which I thought was a bit puzzling because he's not at the political science department. And while I'm a political scientist, I write only on higher education. I have been writing only on higher education the past 3 or 4 years. So it sort of gels. A political scientist at the Department of Education and a political scientist who writes only on higher education, not so much on politics these days. And Dr. Parulekar and staff and students from the Goa Institute of Management. Very warm welcome to you all. I now invite Dr. Parulekar, or is that something which you're going to announce? Okay, thanks. I'll leave that to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pushkar, for your kind words. Moving right along, I would like to invite Dr. Ajit Parulekar, who is the Director of Goa Institute of Management, a PhD in Marketing and MSc in Health Economics, Policy and Management from the London School of Economics, with 2 decades of experience in academics and as a brand manager in the pharmaceutical sector. Please, sir.
Good evening, everyone. I'm quite surprised that Dr. Pushkar is surprised that a business school is only about business. I mean, business can't kind of function without politics, cannot function without culture, society, anthropology, art, all of this. And I think, we at GIM are quite enamored by overall having a liberal arts kind of way of looking at business, and not just looking at purely business from a profit kind of point of view. And that's not something that's recent. That's something that thankfully has been there, so to say, from the time our founding fathers put up the Goa Institute of Management. We're absolutely thrilled to be, we've had a lot of informal kind of collaborations with the ICG. We're really thrilled to kind of have this co-branded kind of a program with ICG. and we hope that this is just going to be the first among a lot more joint initiatives that we'll have with the International Center for. So we're really, really happy to be collaborating with ICG and Dr. Pushkar. We've already started conversations about what else we can do in the year. I'm sure they'll come to fruition very soon. So let me just say how come GIM, and we have a talk that is on statelessness and migration, kind of challenges associated with that in South Asia, and how Professor Brad Blitz is kind of part of all of this initiative. So we were doing we were doing really a funded research project with the University of Leeds, in which Professor Divya was the lead investigator from GIM's side. And there were a total of 8 such, funded projects by the British Academy. And Professor Brad Blitz was overseeing all of these 8 projects. And as a part of that, when he visited, to see the India project, we thought he's a gem of a person. We should kind of prevail upon him to accept our invitation, and he's really been kind to accept that invitation. So here we have him here. Statelessness, as you know, is something there's no country that's spared from issues of statelessness. It's a phenomena that is present in virtually every country. It's something that we don't see face to face every day, except when you read a lot of the reports about things like Rohingyas and so many more worldwide. Issues about really having an official identity, what it can do to people. I mean, imagine not having a birth certificate, not having a passport, not having any legit document. It just takes away all basic rights from you. Education, access to healthcare, travel, so many things, without an identity there. I'm nowhere close to having any kind of expertise on statelessness. I'm really looking forward to what Professor Brad has to say about this. I've been given the pleasant duty of introducing him, so I'm going to read some small parts from a really long, big, exhaustive CV that I have in front of me. Brad received his PhD from Stanford. He's a professor currently of international politics and policy at UCL, University College London. And I also know that at the Institute of Education there, he's also been the director of the British Academy DFID program, which was on tackling slavery, human trafficking, and child labor in modern business. That's really where we got to meet him, and this whole kind of connection started off. He also is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. He's also a senior fellow at the Global Migration Center in the Graduate Institute at Geneva. He's been part of a very large number of different projects that he's been the principal investigator, co-investigator, sitting on panels that have aggregated a variety of different studies. So I'm going to read only a few of those so that you have an idea of, especially the ones that are related to what he's going to talk about today. He recently acted as a principal investigator for a funded project on refugee and migration reception systems in the Mediterranean, as well as on a EU Commission project which seeks to understand how asylum seekers access legal and procedural information. In March 2019, he began a 5-year project on a 17.4 million hub on gender, justice and security, which was funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund and the London School of Economics. He's had several publications on statelessness, and I'll just talk about 2 or 3 of them and then kind of hand over to him. His publications include Statelessness in the European Union, which is about displaced, undocumented and unwanted, which is by the Cambridge University Press. This was in 2011. He's also published Statelessness and Citizenship, which is a comparative study on the benefits of nationality, which was by Edward Elgar. This was again 2011. He completed a US Department-funded project on measuring the costs of statelessness. He's contributed to a very large number of different organizations, including being an advisor to the UNDP, advisor and consultant to UNDP, to UNICEF, to the UN Office of, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, to the World Bank, to the OSCI, to the Council of Europe, DFID, several NGOs. So ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Brad to talk to us.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here, to be a guest of the International Centre Goa and of the Goa Institute of Management. It's really been a wonderful collaboration. And I might just start by saying that those strands, those dots actually do come together, in that I am often looking at non-citizens. And it's in that context where issues of labor exploitation, modern slavery, migration, forced migration rear their ugly heads. And in fact, I'm currently based in the Department of Education, Practice and Society, so it covers pretty much everything. And that also allows me to make up my research agenda to some extent as I go along. So I want to share some of my thoughts and findings with you, and also how they relate to South Asia. I should start with an observation, and that is that as I traveled to Goa, I transited via Doha, which is a city, as you know, very much run by South Asians. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was attending a meeting in Dubai, where we brought together our partners from India and Pakistan. It was a place where both could meet. And we were based in a city where the dominant languages are Hindi and Urdu. So now I'm here proposing to talk to you about issues of migration and citizenship, and I recognize that I'm doing so in a country where people know rather a lot about this from their own lived experiences. They know what it means to be a migrant. They know what it means to have citizenship rights tested, and if not formally, then in practice. So what can I really add to this? As an academic, one of my central aims is to clarify and explain. And as a social scientist, we're not normally, though sometimes, but we're not always, I should say, in the business of making predictions. So I can't tell you if it's going to rain tomorrow, but I probably won't be taking an umbrella. And as a social scientist, what we can do is we can raise concerns, we can identify problems, and we can call for further diagnosis. And sometimes we can even entertain. And I say that because I have a colleague who occupies himself outside of the classroom as a magician. He also rides a bicycle around campus blindfolded. Somehow he manages to do so without riding into the lake. But my aim today is to remove the blindfold and try to share some insights with you. So when we talk about global migration, when we look at migration patterns both to and from this region, try to do this without blinding anyone. So here we have South Asia, right? This color here. So obviously where the arrow is pointing. And what we see is pretty much everything going on. So you have India, which is a magnet for workers from neighboring states. You have southern India, which is attracting migrant labor from the north. There's considerable out-migration, as you see, to different continents, overwhelmingly to the Gulf, but also to North America, to Australia as well. And what we know is that these migrants will enjoy vastly different outcomes. While migration has never been easier, and that people are clearly moving between countries and within them, the rights people enjoy are very sharply delineated. And so there are great differences whether you are a contract worker in the Gulf or a young person in Australia, and you have to be young actually to get into Australia, to the skilled migrant in Europe, who in order to settle actually needs to demonstrate an income of over £30,000. There are all of these differences which affect us well beyond our passports. And there are classes and categories of migrant. So it makes for a fascinating topic of study, but for millions it's their reality, and above all it is shaped by state policies. And in spite of globalization, states still have the power to determine who may enter, who may not, and if you are allowed to enter, how long for. Now, in the context of statelessness, statelessness describes people who are not considered nationals by any state. We've got two conventions, in fact, on this. But under the 1954 convention, individuals who have received nationality neither automatically or through an individual decision under the operation of laws may be known as de jure stateless. But there are also countless others who cannot call upon their rights. They can't call upon their rights for protection, and they are de facto stateless people. And these may include refugees, for example, but they may also include undocumented people who, even if they formally have citizenship, they can't access it. It doesn't offer them practical protection. And so while stateless people enjoy human rights under international law, they often face barriers that prevent them from accessing their rights. And these include the right to establish a legal residence, to travel, to work in the formal economy, to send your children to school, access basic health services, to buy property, to vote, and the list goes on. And I would say common to all these forms of statelessness is the idea of discrimination, and discrimination which plays out in terms of inequality. So we can identify direct discrimination, which is on the basis of nationality, and that may be formally recorded in law. But we can also identify structural discrimination, which is often indirect, but it's nonetheless extremely pertinent. So there are many forms of statelessness, and you can become stateless by being denied or deprived of your citizenship, often, for example, as punishment for supporting the losing side in a war of independence, or indeed a war. In fact, this is what we're seeing for some ISIS fighters. European states have actually been stripping them of their citizenship. Or you might see your citizenship withdrawn after having been identified as a fifth column. Or you might lose it during a period of state succession when a country may break apart, creating two countries, or many. Or as a result of gender discrimination, where women are not allowed to pass on their nationality to their children. And this is especially pertinent in cases where families break up. Let's say you have a binational family, the marriage is dissolved, or there's a divorce, and then what happens to the children? Or you might have a conflict of laws between states. Or practically speaking, you might find that births are not registered. There are administrative faults and other barriers which just prevent people from establishing their identity. We don't really know the precise number of stateless people. Estimates vary. Formally, the UNHCR is saying there are 10 million stateless people, but I think this doesn't really deal certainly with the de facto population, which includes refugees and IDPs, but also those who are dealing with the results of mass displacement as a result of this ever-growing number of people who are now forcibly displaced, close to 70 million people. And of course there are stateless people in detention. So I'd like to just show you some well-documented groups of stateless people before we talk about Asia. So these are the Nubians in Kenya, and they arrived with the British Army over 100 years ago. And we have similar situations in parts of the former colonial world where you may have had groups that had either originally migrated or settled but weren't formally recognized when the state achieved independence. And so this is a very large slum now, just on the outskirts of Nairobi. And then we have here, these are the estate Tamils in Sri Lanka, and they arrived in They arrived in Sri Lanka from Tamil Nadu. Again, this was under British colonial rule. They were really isolated in these plantations which were really run as almost whole economies. Their citizenship rights were formally restored to them 15 years ago when the law was changed. Now, some in fact were allowed to repatriate, or some were repatriated to southern India. But in practice, many of them still cannot rely on their rights to vote or go to school, and as a result may be stuck on these plantations in southern and central Sri Lanka. And then here are the Rohingya of Burma, and now also Bangladesh. We know what has happened to them. Their citizenship was withdrawn by Burma. Again, they're not recognized as one of the national groups. They're described as the descendants of migrants who have come from Bangladesh, and as a result, they have been denied a host of rights, including the right to marry, and that was what was actually forcing people to leave until the recent crisis where hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly displaced over the border. And this is a picture of people in Bangladesh who are working as actually bonded laborers, so it connects to the work that we were doing around modern slavery. They're working on fishing vessels. And then here we have a situation as a result of state secession. So these are Crimean Tatars. So this is a group that was forcibly transported from Ukraine to Central Asia by Stalin. So this was a result of policies in the 1930s and 40s. They were falsely accused of collaborating with the Nazis. Hundreds of thousands of people transported, many died en route, and about 20 years ago they started coming back to Ukraine, now in Crimea. Their situation has been complicated most recently by the Russian occupation of Crimea because they have had precarious rights to land and difficulty of establishing their land rights. And then we have two countries, two states, which produced explicitly racial and racist policies. So we have, first of all, in Cote d'Ivoire, ethnic purity laws, which have been put in place to lock out the descendants of West African descent, and the Dominican Republic, where we have the descendants of Haitians who've been denied the right to register the births of their children. And as a result, this has led to mass expulsions. Let me get to it. So, in the case of South Asia, and in particular, say, India, there are many groups of concern here. We know that there are groups that have been locked out and suffered as a result of multiple conflicts in this region. Principally, I would say conflicts that have been initiated as a result of reconfigurations, post-colonial rule, and various independence movements. But then there are others of concern, for example, Tibetans in northern India, there are Chakma refugees in Arunachal Pradesh, there are ethnic Nepalese who've been expelled from Bhutan, and then most recently we have the current crisis in Assam. Now, as you know, millions of people in Assam are facing the threat of statelessness, and what has happened is that they've been excluded from the National Register of Citizens, which is an updated register of all Indian citizens, and this is only the second time, as I understand, that the register has actually taken place. And according to the new law, those who can register are only those whose names either appear on the 1951 National Register people whose names appeared on voters' lists in Assam up to the 24th of March 1971, or their descendants, or people who can prove that they came from Bangladesh between 1966 and 1971 and were registered again, as well as all Indian citizens, including their descendants who moved to Assam after 1971. And in addition, then, those who can register are those who have admissible documents. So those documents may include land and tenancy records, birth certificates, passports, bank, post office accounts, school and university certificates. You see how it goes. So the most marginal are clearly the most disadvantaged. And when a draft law was released in 2018, 4.1 million people were left off. This has been revised. The numbers come down to just under 2 million. But again, we hear a language that distinguishes between people or categories of people. So some people are described as infiltrators. These are largely Muslims who emigrated from Bangladesh. Other groups are described as refugees, so the descendants of refugees. So these are Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains, people who fled persecution. And although there have been some revisions now to the citizenship amendment, religious minorities, poor and undocumented groups are clearly at risk. So why does this matter? Beyond the human rights angle, which I would nonetheless say is paramount, this matters because statelessness can create serious instability, both within states and between them. So if you look, for example, at the Great Lakes region, we think about the problems that followed, both created and followed the genocide in Rwanda, the ethnic violence in Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are ethnic conflicts which largely had a nationality base to them. They spilled over. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the process. And there are similar threats in South Asia. Nothing of that scale just yet, but there are nonetheless threats. So what does this mean in practice? I'm going to share some hard truths with you. And the first hard truth is that the deprivation of citizenship has a profoundly negative effect on individuals, families, and communities, local and national government. And to support my claim, I'm going to share some research findings with you. So with funding from the US State Department, we put together a team focusing on these 4 countries, Bangladesh, Kenya, Slovenia, and Sri Lanka, to examine what is the cost of statelessness? What does statelessness mean over time for people? And what we did was we carried out a livelihood study. We surveyed 970 households. We also complemented this with interviews. And we used the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework to do so. And this is a really interesting tool because at the center of it is this assets pentagon, this idea that you have various types of assets that can be converted into financial capital, ultimately money. So as educators, we very much believe in the idea of human capital. You educate people, you're actually investing in people, and the return on the investment, as parents, this is something we all, I'm sure, absolutely believe is going to improve the quality of our children's lives. They're going to get access to better schools, better universities, better jobs, better lives. And there are many forms of capital. There's natural capital. We have an abundance of natural capital in this beautiful state. There's, of course, financial capital, which is the money in our accounts and our factories as well. There's physical capital. But there's also social capital, which include the networks that we create among ourselves, and especially in diaspora groups, these networks may help to enable people to share information, to develop business ideas, practices, and the rest. So the idea is that the assets you have here may be affected by a shock. In this instance, by the vulnerability context, this is the loss of citizenship. So we wanted to see how does the loss of citizenship affect these these assets that people have. And we used a range of criteria. We wanted to look at what this meant in terms of policies and practices, and in both directions, and how this affected livelihood strategies. So we used both objective and subjective criteria. We wanted to look at income. Very difficult to ask people about their income. When you're interviewing people or conducting surveys, we often have to use some sort of proxies. You ask, how much money do you spend rather than how much do you earn? We asked people about their health. So we had people report their health on a scale. We asked them about how they exercise their rights, whether to culture, religious practice, their physical security. We asked about access to services, hospitals, safety, drinking water. And we also, to get a sense of physical capital, we asked about housing, shelter, the availability of toilets and that. So we're using a series of measures to try to better understand how people's lives are structured. And then with some quantitative economists, we used multivariate regression analysis to see what was the impact on people's livelihoods assets. So there's 5 categories. We wanted to look at the impact of vulnerability. We wanted to look at livelihood strategies. And we also wanted to see how does this play out in terms of gender. And what we found was really quite telling. We found, first of all, that statelessness decreased income by 33%. So even if people had their rights restored to them, like in Sri Lanka, they still had 33% less income. They had 60% less chance of owning property. And they had significantly less schooling. So human capital acquisition was down. In some cases, stateless people had perhaps 6 years less education. We also found some really important gender considerations. So larger families had more social capital, so more networks, let's say, and this increased with each additional member. But what we found, most tellingly, was that in female-headed households, the presence of formerly stateless people may have decreased social capital. That is, perhaps there was a loss of status, but with each additional female member, the prospect of greater financial capital was altogether greater. And so what that told us was that actually women were much better strategizers in the struggle against poverty and exclusion, and therefore, from a development planning perspective, it made perfect sense to direct policies aimed at women and to engage them up front. And so what we found was that the effects of statelessness linger. They carry over, and there remain these critical gaps. And this is even more evident when we consider just what citizenship actually does. So we did this other study on the benefits of citizenship. We looked at several countries here. And what we found was that, first of all, the idea of the state as a guarantor of rights was deeply problematic because in many parts of the world, ethnic, religious, and local ties are much more significant than your nationality. And as my friend's colleague Kelly Staples argues, citizenship in weak states like Congo, for example, a state which can hardly be considered rights protecting, varies and means very little, I should say, especially when you consider also hard states like Myanmar, which has a tradition of oppressing minorities. So this idea that citizenship means the same thing in different countries is simply not true. And so we had asked, well, what does citizenship make? What does citizenship do? How does it affect people's access to rights and resources? How does it improve qualities of lives? And what barriers still exist? And again, we were looking at Kenya, we were looking at the effects, the long-term effects of this, as well as in Sri Lanka. And ultimately, we found really contrasting opinions. What we found, though, was that many of those who may have obtained citizenship nonetheless experienced day-to-day struggles. And we found, looking at this overall, that although citizenship had improved labor market access and property ownership, it didn't remove inequalities. And the benefits of citizenship were not evenly distributed. So younger people benefited much more than older people. We also know that certain ethnic groups benefited more than others, and that there was fragmentation and division that occurred both before and after people were granted citizenship. But what we did find as well was that documentation, and this is why it speaks to Assam, documentation was essential to the realization of rights. Not just birth certification, but any form of documentation was absolutely critical. And that demographics matter. So you had a large number of people relative to the overall population, so like in Kenya, there was a clear political interest in regularizing their status. And this raises all sorts of other concerns, especially if we're thinking about Assam. Also, thinking about this more broadly in the post-conflict legacy, recognition and exoneration have really important implications for the successful integration of migrants and formerly stateless people. So community building, confidence building is terribly important. And also, populations with a recognized ethno-national identity, an identity that you could actually point to, an identity which reflected a shared understanding, a historical relationship with the state concerned, appeared to be more easily integrated. But above all, we found that the ending of direct discrimination on the basis of nationality doesn't undo structural effects or other modes of discrimination. So what does this mean for India? Well, the creation of millions of stateless people in Assam, if not corrected quickly, may not only bring anxiety and suffering to large numbers of families, but it also risks creating division within India and in the neighboring states. This will be most evident in the labor market, but it will also play out in terms of access to education, welfare, and other sectors. Someone somewhere is going to have to pick up the bill for this. Others will be paying the price for the disenfranchisement that looks very much likely to happen. Above all, we know that impoverishing local populations is not a means to economic development. And arguably, a poor state like Assam may fall further behind. So, as I've tried to argue, citizenship has long been recognized as an important marker of a dynamic multinational state post-independence like India. And in that context, migration has also proven to be an effective livelihood strategy for millions. Statelessness remains a major challenge, a challenge to human rights. It undermines individuals, households, but it's also a problem for the state. It's a problem for the state because it denies the state potential taxes, it denies potential revenue, and it creates instability. And that is one of the central tensions and challenges facing India. So I've tried to identify some of the pitfalls that may face both the national and state government based on my reading from other contexts. And I sincerely trust that lessons can be learned quickly. And in the meantime, all I can say is thank you for your indulgence. I'd like to say watch this space, but I think this is a really contentious space. And I think many people are watching the situation in Assam now. But with that, I will thank you.
We could have a question and answer session now if anyone would like to ask any questions. Yes, please.
Professor. First of all, sincere compliments for throwing light on an issue which is burning right under our feet, but we are not sensitized to the extent that you have been. We appreciate your very incisive analysis and the light that you have thrown on various aspects. The earth was created by God Almighty, and it is the humans who created the states. And the state of humanity is so abominable because of the statelessness that it is a terrifying thought. My question is, does United Nations or world bodies have any accepted and established convention to prevent, correct such things happening all around us? What are the ways to sequester such things? Because we see rising, streaks among the leadership of the different countries in the world, also clinging to their various things. Not allowing other countries or other people to come. There is of course a flip side to it. Whole of Central Asia and some Africa wants to settle in Europe. But what is the way forward? What is the trajectory for us as humanity? If your thoughts on that, sir.
Wow. It's on. Okay. Yeah. Really tough questions. I mean, there's international law, and that's what the UN would say. They'd say, oh, we've got statelessness conventions, and we're going around the world, we're pressing states to sign on to them because that's what we do. But in many cases, these conventions or signatures are just not worth the ink or paper that is being used, because we see how states are behaving. We see that there are increasing numbers of people who are being displaced, who are being denied protection every day. I've been trying to raise with the UN that we need to treat stateless people as a specific category of concern. Just the way we've got development programs that say whether it's for river island dwellers or some countries have particular programs for veterans or that, to say, look, this is a structural problem. This is something you need to consider, not just in terms of how countries may or may not sign on to declarations, but also in terms of addressing basic need for protection and the relationship between protection and societal discrimination. One way forward is public education. I think people need to know not just about the living conditions of people who've been denied their rights, but also just how fragile our rights are. So I've met, over the last couple of years, I've met many people who had very comfortable middle-class lives in Syria, for example, and now they are living thousands of kilometers away from their homes as refugees and unable to work, deplorable conditions, facing all sorts of mental illness as well as tensions within the family. This all happened very, very quickly. Recognizing that any of us could be displaced, any of us could be subject to these pitfalls, I think is really central to showing a bit of compassion and understanding for what it means for such people, and the way forward must be regularization. And what I would actually say to the government of India is, actually, rather than counting people who may be included or excluded, find ways to include everyone, right? So you create a census, you identify that there are groups of people that are not registered, register them, work to improve their lives so they can be properly integrated. After all, this country was once upon a time a series of competing kingdoms and areas where we didn't have records of people, and a country was created around it, drawing together people from different national, ethno-national, religious, linguistic backgrounds. So the idea of actually separating people out now is not going to help you. And pushing people over the border is also not a way of actually handling a very delicate situation. That's what I would say.
Thank you, sir, for addressing that question. Do we have any more questions?
Good evening. The Rohingya issue was, I being a student, I am in touch with education and things like that, but I was not aware until it happened overnight. Like I just saw the next day over the news. Similarly, the blockade established against Qatar by UAE, Saudi Arabia, and I think Oman. It happened overnight. As in, I never. So it could be like you said. We can find ways to include people, find ways to strengthen the bonds. But it could also happen that those things are only in the media and in the formal space. But behind, at the back of the mind, there is still withheld anger and ideas coming up to exclude people out, remove people out, spoil ties with the other country. So how to address that internally as citizens, as a country? Thank you.
I mean, it's when you're in the Middle East and Qatar and other parts of the Emirates, it is just shocking how people are treated, and the facts that poor people are drawn to work in these countries. They may not just be subject to all sorts of environmental abuse, whether it's working in intense heat without proper breaks and that, but being beaten, having your passport taken away from you, having debt held over your head. I mean, people need to know this in the first instance. So, for example, the idea of treating, whether it's Dubai or other parts of the Middle East, as just a playground, a Disney World for people who want to go and just enjoy themselves. They need to realize, the conditions under which these buildings have been built very, very quickly, and have some awareness for that. And at the same time, we need to press these governments. Some countries have done this by actually preventing their nationals from going to work there. So in particular, I know that there have been bans on sending female workers to some of these countries. This is, again, it's a political thing, and it's about, where are the pressure points, what sensitivity points are there, how can this be used to advance diplomacy. But then again, I think more public knowledge, more public information about how people are being treated and what this means. When we were working on the modern slavery program last year, and so with our colleagues from Go Institute of Management, with Professor Divya and Dipti, we went into spinning mills. We looked at how nylon and other types of thread were being produced. And we looked in Tamil Nadu, and we looked in Vietnam. And there's this perception, this belief, that the clothes we buy are as cheap as possible, and that's why we have to just accept that these conditions take place. What can we really do? Oh, and then, if we don't, well, these people won't have jobs. But alongside that economy are large numbers of people who are earning money from bribes, from fixing jobs for other people. These are, between the middlemen and the other middlemen, there are layers of people who are actually serving corrupt purposes. What if we could actually address that corruption? Is it that a t-shirt costs, I don't know, what would it be? 200 rupees, say? And that's the price that you you have to pay. What if you could still pay 200 rupees without some of that money going to support these corrupt forces that are embedded in the economy? I think we need to start thinking like that.
You expressed concern about Assam. I think the final number is about 2 million. Now, also there is a move to have this across other states in India. So the numbers are going to be, multiplying. So now when such a problem is there at what you have brought out, I'm sure the government of India must be also having some plan in place or in mind about how to take care of these people. So you cannot just throw them out of the country. You just tell them to cross over to other country. Other country may not accept them. They'll say they are not ours. So there's going to be a problem. So what do you think the government of India, a plan they might have in place to tackle this kind of situation? Integrating them in this thing, whether that is going to be, I do not think so. Otherwise, why it is excess spending thousands of crores for identifying the people? If integration is their plan. If integration is not the plan, then what can be a viable kind of a thing plan the government could have in place or can have in place?
I would argue alongside integration there's education. And we see what education has done. We see how change has been brought about in southern India, right? So the demographics of southern India are very different from northern India. People are not having 10 children here, for example. Women are integrated in the workforce. People are living longer. Education is part of it. We are talking about more backward provinces. There's no question about that. And there does seem to be an element, a strong element, of a sort of nationalist rhetoric, using minorities as a way of seemingly strengthening central control. That's a cynical argument, that these people are just being used. Colleagues use the term Hindu nationalism. I think nationalism is sufficient, but it does appear to be directed against certain categories. It's not just actually Hindu nationalism. It's certain categories of minorities, but principally minorities that may appear to have some ethnic attachment to neighboring states. I think, this country has a very painful history of forced migration and separation. We can use the term partition, but beyond partition, the idea of large scales of people being moved from one country to another has never been done peacefully. To my mind, there are very, very few examples you can point to of that. So I think, in terms of integration, you would want to say, okay, well, how can we diffuse tensions? How can we address concerns with respect to migration? It's a long-term planning view that requires investment in education, health, engaging more women in the economy. There are certain developmental approaches that one can look at, and maybe you would see a difference in 10 or 15 years, let's say, and those tensions can be kept down. That's probably what I would say. It would require a considerable collective effort.
But that is a long term.
It is a long term.
Short term, immediate term, what do you think could be the solution?
I think in the short term, you want to prevent violence, right? That's the big concern, right? So what are the triggers of violence? So to say, okay, what can be done to prevent inter-ethnic and interstate violence? And then what can be done to address if there are irregular flows of people? There are ways of managing the border, but that has to be done in cooperation with the neighboring state. And so joint training initiatives as well. And equally, finding, whether it's the World Bank or international donors, what sort of social development programs can they put in place so that people don't feel that they're forced to come to India for work. So find alternative job creation for such people. That's a medium-term plan, that one, let's say. But that these need to be sequenced. That's what I would say.
So I would like to address the question. When you talk about integration of the migrants into the populace over there, a couple of years back or very recently we saw the photograph of the child washing up on Europe's beaches, which sparked the European community and Angela Merkel to open the borders for the people coming from the Middle East, Libyan war and all. But then if you notice, there was a lot of backlash from the local communities because many of these minority groups which were trying to be integrated into the societies over there, there were a lot of horrific atrocities that were carried out which were pegged on them. So how does the state tackle this? Because if you want to be inclusive, but you are on the milder side, you might have somebody coming into your own place and then overriding everything out there. So what does the state do for that?
Yeah, this is a really really difficult challenge, because on the one hand, Germany had its own views about this. There were various reasons given as to why they opened the doors. So first of all, they opened the doors and they attracted highly skilled and skilled migrants. They didn't have to worry about getting engineers, dentists, doctors, right? Those people came. But then there are others that came as well. And within Europe and within parts of Asia, there is considerable sensitivity around, in particular, Islam and Muslim men, and concern around how this might affect people's lives. And this idea that actually integration is something which has to go both ways, right? So that people are admitted to a country, they're given refugee protection, but they still need to understand rules, codes, and conventions of those countries. It's not just, okay, you're here, now you're working. No, you need to understand that. So, for example, one thing that was raised in Britain is, the migrants, it's like, no, you don't walk down the street carrying a bottle of alcohol, right? So drinking is something you do in a particular place, not on your way to or from work, let's say. That's a minor thing. More serious maybe, before we get to, say, treatment of women or treatment of others, driving, for example. So there are certain codes which you would say need to be understood. And how is this communicated? To my mind, there's actually been very little in the way of this the soft sort of education around integration in some of these countries. It's one thing for children go to school, right? So children become integrated. But what do you do with other people? What do you do if these societies also don't necessarily want to integrate? Where's the dividing line? In Europe, we've had all sorts of struggles over the wearing of, for example, religious symbols in public. And the states are really divided on this. Some countries they've banned the hijab, in other countries they haven't. I don't know if it works better in one or the other. I think that for many people their religious identity is part of them. Right? It doesn't mean that they are prone to violence or they're prone to converting someone. It's just that's who they are and what they do. Radicalization is another matter, I would say, and that's where we need to be aware. So that's where we need to understand what are the signs, and they may be far removed from how people behave on the streets. Let's say it's probably much more of a worry in terms of what is happening on social media or behind the scenes. But these are discussions which we have to have in a non-racist way, in a way that says, look, we have to just understand that these are sensitive areas. How can we all work together?
Because normally what would happen is, the moment you try to profile the person, then the next thing that jumps up is there is racial profiling. First, they're doing racial profiling. So, it becomes a domino effect. So then the state thinks, why do I go through all this trouble? Might as well keep them out once and for all.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a very funny question. Funny because I don't know how international politics and the government work along. But I am a Goan. Until 61 there were Portuguese. Post 61 Portuguese left. And recently they have given permission for people to come and settle down there if they can identify the parentage as being Goans. If a similar situation was made applicable to Great Britain vis-a-vis entire India, what would have been the state of India?
This is very true, and we know that this is where I say, well, I'm American actually, but this is very true, and we know that Britain has increasingly restricted its immigration laws to make it harder and harder for people from the Commonwealth to come and settle, and that you could be a British protected person with actually no real protection from Britain. And these very strange categories of citizenship, what do they actually mean? But you're absolutely right.
What is also...
Actually, I was just going to ask something similar, that we need to bring these categories, these subtler forms of statelessness in the making, into these narratives on statelessness and migration, because if one is looking at like Goan citizens, because the Goans have got Portuguese passports to be able to work in the within the European Union, but they are working in UK. Now with Brexit there are other issues, and then when they are there, now people are still rushing, although there's Brexit, there's a lot of rush. So they're rushing in the hope that they can somehow put their feet there, and they're not rushing just because of their whims and fancies. They're going there because conditions here are bad, and there's no proper, both socially and economically, especially for certain communities. So therefore they're migrating. Now they don't have voting rights here, but they have their houses here and they have the right to hold their houses here, but they don't have voting rights. So the future, of Goa is also affected by this, and this statelessness has these other implications as well. But it's a different kind of a statelessness, and it's very subtle. You can't realize it. It's like, oh well, they've opted for Portuguese passports, but that's subtle forced migration, and which is the kind of statelessness that's in the making, because after some time, this brazen violence nobody wants to look at. So then they will do it in a more subtle way. So it's I think this needs to be drawn into the narrative of statelessness actually.
So, because the issue is that in acquiring the Portuguese passport, they must renounce their Indian nationality.
Yes.
Right. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, generally, a Portuguese passport's quite a good one to have, in that you can work within the EU. But I understand, of course, why people want to work in the UK. There is going to be some sort of arrangement, we're told. Yeah. What may happen, though, is there are questions, I suppose, with respect to children, ultimately. I mean, this is something to consider.
I was saying, sir, a lot of issues have precipitated, also because of appropriation of the land by the immigrants themselves. Look at US, for example, they finish the local ethnic population. US has 3 times India's land, but 30% of our population. Australia is a similar story. They could, the countries, these 2 countries by way of example, could benefit themselves with more human capital, but they are preventing it for the ego or foolishness or God knows what. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go and settle in New York or California, but there are vast tracts in mid US which are open. Of course, it is a very simplistic solution for me to say there are many views, but we are not thinking at that humanity level, we are thinking at the state level in a very assertive, fanatic way now. I don't know. I don't have a question, but this is just an observation.
Any more questions?
What is the role of United Nations for facing this challenge? How they can cooperate and coordinate in various countries? Any solution is possible?
The United Nations now is, of course, subject to all sorts of pressure because the United States has stopped participating in all sorts of agencies, is shifting the burden onto others. We know, for example, they've cut refugee admissions right down. So in the past couple of years, Canada was taking a significant share of refugees. You know, the UN is made up of states, and it bears many of the scars of that design. You know, it's not a nice, cuddly institution. It may do some good work in certain areas and certain places, and there may be some very, very good agencies, let's say. But when we start talking about the Security Council or the General Assembly, both institutions are hampered by their members.
Only 35 countries have paid their contribution out of 190.
So we are studying Tibetan refugees, and we found that those statelessness adversely impacts livelihood. But with regard to Tibetan refugees, though they could avail of citizenship in India, many of them do not take Indian citizenship and prefer to remain stateless. India has not signed any refugee conventions, so they are not even refugees, they are foreigners. So do you know of any other community which do offer citizenship, refuse citizenship, and prefer to remain stateless?
That's a really interesting question, because I think that with the Tibetans, there's been the Tibetan community in exile is, let's say, culturally more developed than it is politically. And there's been greater emphasis on the preservation, where possible, of Tibetan culture. But ultimately, you need institutions to protect and preserve your culture. And for many of us, those institutions are state, whether national or local, or federal or local, let's say, or national. There's possibly a point of comparison with certain Palestinian groups, only in as far as, for example, in parts of the world, Palestinians have been denied nationality. And the people who have denied the nationality have done so on the grounds that this is both going to strengthen their claim to recover their homeland, but also because they are in conflict with Israel. Now, you would say, well, Lebanon's argument with Israel doesn't necessarily mean that the people who have been there for now generations should be living in these slums. these now urbanized refugee camps without various rights. So I think they can only work in there are only a handful of professions that they can actually work in. Garbage collection being one of them. I mean, they're really degrading occupations. They might say that they choose to be stateless, but it's hard to see that this is a direct choice because actually they're not given the choice, like where they are, say, in Jordan. I need to think about situations where certain groups have formally refused or rejected citizenship. I mean, every year I get emails from individuals who are saying they've renounced their citizenship. And then there's normally the second part of the email says, now what can I do? Perhaps people not realizing just how important these documents are until they're destroyed. But the Tibetan case is particularly acute because you have this occupation and forced assimilation and intensive development in Tibet now, such that traditional ways of life are literally being bulldozed as ethnic groups are being settled in those areas, and as a result of national expansion. So it's very, very difficult.
Maybe also, sir, in exile you have the government in exile, which has formal institutions. So perhaps if the whole community moves together with their government, etc., then it may help.
Maybe. I mean, it's been argued that actually what the Tibetans have managed to do in the way in which other groups perhaps haven't is that they've retained this sort of cultural identity. And it's also an identity which has sort of largely been romanticized, right? As part of a peaceful movement, largely peaceful, until just in the last 5-10 years, where we're seeing instances of people setting themselves on fire and rejecting the course that the Dalai Lama has led. It's very difficult when you're faced with an occupation by a country as powerful and as large as China.
So I think we'll take up the last question before we wrap up the Q&A session.
Thank you, Alicia. Professor Blitz, my question was arising from the fact that you said statelessness essentially is a consequence of state policy. So as a consequence of state policy, and usually we are very reluctant until it affects us to actually have conversations around this because it's a particularly sensitive topic. So my question more in terms of as an individual who as yet seems to be untouched by this question, what could we do in our own individual capacity, because the focus of the conversation has been about states and institutions, etc. So what do you think individuals could do in their own way to kind of encourage or nurture conversations around this question? Because we are sometimes not very comfortable having these conversations, whether it is with a close group of people or whether it is with a larger group of people, or fear that it is a sensitive topic. So how would you suggest that we could address it, maybe at an individual level, obviously, but then escalate to an institutional and a societal or a state level?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, one thing that always comes up is support for legal aid. So what can be given to people so A, they know their rights, and B, that they can access their rights through lawyers if necessary. So it may very well be gathering together teams of whether they're immigration lawyers, immigration, employment, and labor lawyers. I think that's really, really helpful. So universities, centers, they can set up clinics. NGOs can do so. There's material support, of course, that groups may need. So whether they're Tibetans or Rohingya, having drop-in centers, we know that that's helpful. We see that in other parts of. Often there is, and often these are actually organized through religious institutions. So they're places where people donate clothes, everything from clothes to nappies, soaps, that sort of thing. Economic opportunities as well. So the creation of certain cooperatives, that's quite interesting in various places where you've had displaced groups that have been given opportunities, whether it's, for example, let's say in the hotel sector around here. So creating jobs for people is really important, as well as education, whether it's scholarships or identifying ways in. So that's what people can do to sort of remediate these issues. There are things which, as individuals, one can also do to prevent, let's say, among, say, certain groups that may be at risk. And that is that you should have copies of all your documents, have them in multiple places, ensure that you have self-verifying ways of proving A, B, and C. So it could be things like LinkedIn profiles, social media profiles that are linked to formal documents. And equally recognizing where the risk may occur. So I would always say to my students, in the event of a natural disaster or political emergency, some sort of conflict or something like that, do not surrender yourself to the state. Keep running. Because I've interviewed people who've been sitting in refugee camps for a very long time, or in shelters, waiting to get out. And I remember what happened to my elderly aunt and uncle when there was a hurricane that approached and hit. Actually, they're part of Florida. They went to a shelter. It was a week before they could actually leave the shelter without showers and flowing water and all that. I mean, just the discomfort. And that was just one instance in a highly developed country. So that people need to understand that they need to be self-reliant where possible, and that the state is not the first resort, but often the last resort. And that's what I tell students.
We have one more question coming up.
Good evening, sir. So my question is, are business schools across the globe talking about this issue? And how can the students of the business school contribute towards this?
So, I don't know if business schools are really talking about questions of, say, citizenship, but they are dealing with issues that relate to non-citizens in terms of how people are being recruited, let's say. So that's probably the first way in which, as a business school graduate, you might come in contact with this, right? So let's say you set up a company and you want to employ people and you may be employing migrant labor. One of the first things that will be asked of you, most probably, is to verify people's documentation. And so that might be where you'll learn, oh, wait a minute, this person isn't documented, what can be done? Now, you might be in a position to help that person get documented so they can work, right? That's the first thing. That would be a really good thing to do. Related to that are issues around the way in which labor is being used. So we saw in the spinning mills and that, the degree to which migrant labor is being protected. So when we interviewed people and we said, are people paying fees to come and work for you? And they said, no, we recruit them. So how are they recruited? And so we put on a transport service. Well, they may have sent buses to bring these people down, but we don't know whether or not such people were actually paying bribes and putting themselves in situations of debt, and debt which they couldn't necessarily recover from. So debt is also a major thing to identify. So as someone who may be setting up a business or the like, the role of recruiters is really critical, and many businesses are saying we will not require workers to pay fees to come and work for us, because we realize that that's where there are problems. So those are things that you can start to look out for. I think it's largely in terms of recruitment, and then there may be some questions around the production process. That's not such a problem here. We know that children, in some instances, may be working, but generally there's an understanding that children should not be employed. It's probably the engagement of migrant workers, either from some of the northern Indian states or from possibly Nepal, Bangladesh, or other areas.
Thank you, sir, for addressing all our questions. That was a very interactive and interesting question and answer session. Thank you, Professor Brad, for the enriching session. It's been a real pleasure to hear something so complex explained so clearly. No event is complete without a vote of thanks. I would now like to call upon the Dean Academics of GIM, Professor Neeraj Amarnani, to extend a vote of thanks.
Professor Brad Blitz, Dr. Pushkar, Professor Parulekar, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion of a talk on an interesting topic of the challenges of statelessness and migration in South Asia. I must express our deep gratitude on behalf of the Goa Institute of Management to Professor Brad Blitz for making this trip to Goa in India at the invitation of the Goa Institute of Management. His talk today especially really underscored dimensions of statelessness, discrimination, rights, and helped us see this matter in a whole new light. I mean, for some of us, it was practically one of the first exposures to this as an organized construct. We are indeed thankful to Dr. Pushkar, Director of the ICG, for his support as always in collaborating with the Goa Institute of Management to host this talk. In the welcoming and pleasant setting of the ICG, we hope that as we go along, he'll be more used to the routine of GIM doing these things rather than surprised that Goa Institute of Management also does these types of talks. Right? So we hope together we will remove the surprise element and make it more of a routine element. Right? And of course, thanks to Mr. Galileo Fernandez, coordinates media and PR at the ICG for coordinating all the arrangements. Our thanks especially to our director, Professor Parulekar, for his continuous guidance, enthusiasm, support in all of the ideas that we take to him. He's always one of those who rolls up his sleeves and says, what can I do to make this happen, rather than tells us what to do. So it's his enthusiasm that keeps driving us in our efforts forward. A lot of thanks due to the efforts of Dinesh Kote, Mukesh Kumar and the entire IT team for supporting the infrastructure and the logistics required, especially also to Mr. Ashley Furtado for all the logistics specifically for the event and for the visit of Professor Brad Blitz. We have our very own student volunteers from the Sprockets team, from the PR team who are covering the event, taking the photographs, preserving memories, helping communicate our efforts outside. So thank you very much, folks, for the work you're doing. We really appreciate the effort that our guests today have made to attend this event, attend this talk, including my faculty colleagues, and they've really helped enrich the insights on this topic through their very interesting sometimes and sometimes really insightful and knowledgeable questions as well as comments on the matter we were discussing. And I would really be remiss if I did not single out one colleague out here who's really worked hard in putting together this event, the whole schedule of engagements with Professor Blitz, and that would be Professor Devya Singhal. So thank you very much, Devya, for putting all of this together. Right? We know the work you've done at the back end for all of this. And before I leave, once again, we thank Professor Blitz for sharing his wisdom with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for making time in your busy schedules to join us here this evening. It's been our pleasure to host this event, and I wish you all a pleasant evening ahead.